The fence came down on a Wednesday. Not slowly, not carefully, with a rented hydraulic excavator that arrived at 6:30 in the morning, before the birds had finished singing, before the coffee had finished brewing, before most of Clover Hill Lane had even opened their eyes. 83-year-old Walter Ames heard the machine from inside his kitchen. He set down his mug, he walked to the window, and he watched in silence as 47 years of cedar posts and hand-laid rails fence he had built himself, post by post, summer of 1976, the year his wife Eleanor came home from the hospital holding their daughter for the first time, came crashing down into the dewy grass of a Tuesday morning in September. He didn't yell, he didn't run outside, he didn't even raise his voice. He picked up his phone, he dialed a number he hadn't called in 11 years, and when the man on the other end picked up, Walter said 4 words. "Tommy, it's time. Let me tell you about Clover Hill Lane." It sits in the eastern fold of Garfield County, just outside Glenwood Falls, Ohio, a small town of about 14,000 people where the high school football team still draws a crowd on Friday nights, where the Methodist Church on Birch Street has had the same pastor for 22 years, and where people still leave their screen doors unlocked in the summer because they know their neighbors. The street itself is 9 houses long. Maple trees older than most of the residents line both sides, their roots buckling the sidewalk in gentle, familiar ways. In the summer of 2019, the last summer things were normal on Clover Hill Lane. Those trees were full and green and cast pools of shade across yards where kids played and dogs slept and old men sat on porches and watched the afternoon go by. The lawns were manicured, the gutters were clean, people waved to each other, they shared tomatoes from their gardens, they shoveled each other's driveways without being asked. It was the kind of street that doesn't exist in most of America anymore. The kind of street that people in their 30s drive through slowly sometimes and feel something they can't quite name, a longing for something quieter, something slower, something real. Number 4 Clover Hill Lane sat at the gentle curve of the street, a white 2-story colonial with green shutters, a covered porch, a garden bed along the front walk full of yellow chrysanthemums, and running along the entire right side of the property, a cedar privacy fence 8 feet tall, solid as the day it was built. Stained dark brown, every board perfectly level. That fence had stood for 47 years. It would not survive the summer of 2019. His name was Walter James Ames. Master Sergeant Walter James Ames, United States Army, retired. Enlisted in 1950 at the age of 17, lied about his age, the way boys did back then because he believed in something bigger than himself. Served with the 7th Infantry Division, 32nd Infantry Regiment. Fought in the battles of Heartbreak Ridge and Triangle Hill during the Korean War, 1951 to 1952. Survived 2 winters in those mountains that most men wouldn't survive one. Received the Bronze Star with Valor device for pulling 2 wounded soldiers, one of them a 19-year-old kid from rural Georgia who would have bled out in the snow from a destroyed foxhole under active fire. He never talked about it, not once, not even to Eleanor. After Korea, Walter stayed in the Army, served another 20 years as a logistics and supply chain specialist. Retired in 1973 with commendations, a chest full of ribbons, and a handshake from a general whose name he never dropped at dinner parties because Walter Ames was not that kind of man. He came home to Glenwood Falls, his hometown, the place he'd been born, the place he intended to die, and he married Eleanor Kowalski in the spring of 1974 in the Methodist Church on Birch Street. Bought the house on Clover Hill Lane that same summer, built the fence the summer after. By 2019, Walter was 83 years old. Eleanor had passed in 2014, 5 years a widower. He walked with a slight hitch in his left hip, shrapnel from Heartbreak Ridge still there. The VA doctors said it was safer to leave it, and wore the same style of flannel shirt in 3 different colors, rotating them through the week. He kept the house exactly the way Eleanor had kept it. The chrysanthemums were her idea. He replanted them every spring because she had loved them. His daughter, Karen, lived in Columbus, 2 hours away. She called every Sunday. His grandson, Tyler, was a sophomore at Ohio State and came home for holidays and sometimes brought his roommate because Tyler knew his grandfather would feed them better than the dining hall. Walter always had a pot of something on the stove. He was the kind of man who noticed when the Hendersons at number 7 had a new car and said something kind. The kind of man who drove the Ramos kids to soccer practice when their mother's transmission went out and never mentioned it again. The kind of man who, when a stray cat showed up on his porch in November of 2017 and wouldn't leave, bought a bag of cat food and named her Sergeant and let her sleep by the radiator all winter. He moved slowly, he spoke slowly, he did not make decisions quickly, and he did not unmake them at all. There was one detail about Walter Ames that nobody on Clover Hill Lane knew in the summer of 2019. We'll get to that. The house next door, number 6 Clover Hill Lane, had been vacant for 8 months after old Bert Kelleher passed in November of 2018. His kids sold it in the spring. The sale closed on April 15, 2019. The moving truck arrived on the first Saturday of May, not one truck, two. They were followed by a pearl-white 2020 Range Rover Sport with a personalized Ohio plate, ESQLFE, and a black BMW 7 Series with tinted windows that parked directly across Walter's driveway for 45 minutes while the driver talked loudly on his phone in the middle of the street. His name was Dominic Harlan Fitch, 41 years old, partner at Fitch & Callaway LLC, a civil litigation firm in Columbus that specialized in real estate disputes, corporate contract law, and this is relevant aggressive property boundary litigation. Dominic had made a significant amount of money in the last decade helping developers push out longtime residents and small landowners through legal intimidation tactics. He was good at it. He was proud of it. He had a Porsche at his Columbus office for Tuesdays through Thursdays and the Range Rover for weekends. He had purchased the Glenwood Falls house as a retreat property, a place to unwind. His words to his assistant were, "I'm buying something simple, something I can renovate and flip in 3 years. Glenwood Falls is about to get discovered. I'm getting in early." Dominic Fitch was 5'10", wore a full-zip fleece vest over everything including collared shirts, and had the particular kind of handsomeness that had been slowly eroding for 10 years in a way he had not yet acknowledged. He spoke at a volume appropriate for boardrooms in all settings, including grocery stores and front yards. He laughed at his own observations. He did not ask questions of people he considered his social inferiors. He made statements at them. Walter watched him from the porch that Saturday morning, drinking his coffee, saying nothing. The first red flag came within 2 hours of the moving truck's arrival. One of Dominic's hired movers, a polite young man named Marcus who had apologized twice already for the driveway situation, approached Walter's porch to ask if the fence along the property line had a gate. Before Walter could answer, Dominic appeared from around the moving truck. "It doesn't matter," he said, not looking at Walter. "That fence is going to come down anyway. It's an eyesore and it's blocking the natural light to my east-facing windows. I'll have my landscaper take care of it by end of summer." He said this the way a man says the weather's going to turn, casually, like an observation about the world. Marcus looked at Walter. Walter looked at Dominic. "Good morning," Walter said. Dominic looked at him then, looked him up and down once, the flannel shirt, the worn boots, the old man on a porch with a coffee mug, and nodded once with the kind of nod that is not a greeting but a dismissal. He went back inside. Walter finished his coffee. He went to the garage. He got his notebook. The notebook was a brown leather composition book, the kind with the marble pattern inside cover. Walter had kept one like it for 50 years. In the army it was for logistics, tracking supply chain orders, recording receipts. In retirement it was for notes, the date he planted the chrysanthemums, the date he last had the gutters cleaned, the dates of calls with Karen, the dates of Tyler's visits. He was a man who believed that a life not recorded was a life half forgot. He wrote May 4th, 2019 at the top of the first clean page, and then, new neighbor number 6, Dominic Fitch, stated intention to remove fence, no consultation, driveway blocked approx. 45 mins. 2 weeks later, a warm Saturday in May, the kind of day that smells like mowed grass and somebody's grill starting up in the distance, Dominic's contractor arrived and began taking measurements along the fence line. Walter walked over calmly, no urgency. "Morning," he said to the contractor. "What are we measuring for?" The contractor, a cautious-looking man who clearly sensed something he did not want to be involved in, said he'd been hired to assess the fence for removal. Walter nodded. "You might want to check the survey markers before you do that. The fence sits on a legal easement." The contractor looked at his clipboard. He looked at the fence. He said he'd have to confirm with his client. Dominic came out of the house 10 minutes later wearing the fleece vest and sunglasses. "Mr. Fitch," Walter said. He had walked to the edge of the porch. That fence has sat on that line since 1976. I have the original survey. I have the deed notation. I'd be happy to share copies with you. I'd also encourage you to pull the county property records before you make any decisions." Dominic looked at him over the top of his sunglasses. "Listen, old man," he said, and here's the thing about Dominic Fitch. He said it without a single degree of self-awareness, without the tiniest flicker of what most humans would recognize as caution. "I'm a property attorney. I think I know a little more about deeds and surveys than a retired whatever you are. That fence is 12 inches over the property line and it's coming down. You'll receive correspondence from my office." He went back inside. Walter stood there for a moment. The contractor would later tell his wife that the old man looked the way a mountain looks, not angry, not afraid, just there, just enormously, unmovably there. Walter wrote the date in his notebook. He wrote the time. He wrote Dominic's exact words in quotation marks. And then he went back inside and made himself a sandwich. Direct hit engagement hook. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever genuinely tried to be reasonable with someone who has decided before you've even opened your mouth that they are better than you? Someone who looks right through you like your furniture. Drop a comment right now and tell me what that felt like. Because I think most of you know exactly what Walter felt standing on that lawn. And I think most of you also know that feeling doesn't last. It turns into something else. The letter from Fitch and Callaway LLC arrived on May 29, 2019. It was 3 pages long, single-spaced, and cited 4 separate Ohio property statutes. It claimed that the cedar fence at the eastern border of 4 Clover Hill Lane encroached 11.4 inches into the property at 6 Clover Hill Lane, constituted a continuous trespass under Ohio Revised Code 5303.01, and demanded written acknowledgement of the encroachment and a firm removal date within 30 days. Walter read it twice. He made himself tea. He put the letter in a manila folder he labeled Fitch Correspondence and set it on the shelf above his desk where he kept his important documents neatly. Beside the folder he'd labeled ELEANOR Medical and the one labeled House, Original Deed 1974. He also that same day installed a camera. He already had one over the front door, had put it up in 2016 after somebody's catalytic converter got stolen 3 streets over. But this was a new one. A Lorex 4K outdoor security camera, weatherproof, infrared night vision, mounted on the side of the garage, aimed directly at the fence line and the driveway. Then he made a phone call to the Garfield County Recorder's office and requested a certified copy of his original property survey. What came back was interesting. The survey, conducted in August of 1974 by a licensed Ohio land surveyor named Harold Pitts, now deceased but whose records were fully archived, showed the eastern property line of 4 Clover Hill Lane. The fence, built in 1976, did not sit 12 inches over the line. It sat 3 inches inside Walter's own property. It had always been there. Walter had built it deliberately inset by 3 inches because Eleanor had asked him to leave a small strip for the neighbors to plant something if they wanted. They had never planted anything, but Walter had remembered. He noted this in his journal. He filed the certified survey in the Fitch folder. June was busy. On June 8, Walter's gray 2014 Ford F-150 was keyed along the driver's side door, 3 long scratches from the rear quarter panel to the front wheel well. The Lorex camera captured 47 seconds of footage of a person in a dark hooded sweatshirt doing it at 1:14 in the morning. The figure was careful to stay partially in shadow, but the gait, the build, the shoes, they were all in frame. Walter filed a police report. Officer Sandra Greer from the Glenwood Falls PD came by, looked at the footage, took a copy. She told Walter she'd look into it. She seemed genuinely bothered by it. Walter had the truck repainted. He paid for it himself. He noted the exact cost, $1,847, in the notebook. On June 22, Dominic called the Glenwood Falls zoning office and filed a complaint claiming that Walter's fence violated local height restrictions for residential side yard barriers, citing it as a hazard to sightline clearance for the roadway. This was technically creative and completely incorrect. The fence was in the backyard, not within 40 feet of the road, and Ohio Zoning Code Section 1173.04 exempted it entirely. The zoning officer called Walter to advise him of the complaint, and when Walter explained the code provision, apologized for the inconvenience. Walter wrote the date in his notebook. He wrote the zoning officer's name and badge number. He wrote the word resolved in parentheses. On July 4th, Independence Day, the street full of kids with sparklers, somebody's grill going, music from the Ramos house, someone threw a bag of trash over Walter's fence into his garden. It landed on Eleanor's chrysanthemums. 3 of the plants were crushed. Walter stood in the garden for a long time, looking at the crushed flowers. The street was bright and loud and celebratory. He was alone in his garden, looking at something Eleanor had loved, lying ruined in the dirt. He took photographs, he cataloged the damage. He noted the time, 11:47 p.m., and the approximate trajectory of the throw, which corresponded to a launch point on the other side of the fence from the direction of number 6. He replanted what he could. Wrecked hit engagement hook. You know what gets me about this part of the story? Walter Ames carried a bronze star. He dragged wounded soldiers out of foxholes in the Korean winter. He survived things that would break most of us before breakfast. And here he is on the 4th of July replanting his late wife's flowers at midnight because his neighbor thought it was funny. I want to know, have you or someone you love ever been targeted by someone who thought your quiet was weakness? Drop it in the comments. Because here's what I need you to understand. Walter wasn't being passive. Walter was building something. It happened on a gray Wednesday morning in September. September 11th, 2019, a date Walter would have noted regardless. He was inside in the kitchen making oatmeal, listening to the radio, a local AM station that played old country and gave farm reports on the hour. It was just past 7 in the morning. Sergeant the cat was asleep on the radiator. The coffee was almost done. He heard the machine before he heard anything else. A low mechanical throb, diesel, heavy equipment, then a sound like wood splitting, except louder, except repeated, except not stopping. He walked to the window. The hydraulic excavator was yellow. It had been rented from a Glenwood County equipment supplier, he would learn this later, and operated by a man Dominic had hired through a landscaping company out of Columbus. The man had been told this was a fence removal job on property his employer owned. He had the paperwork. He had been given paperwork. What he had not been given was accurate paperwork. The fence came down in sections. 47 years of cedar, split and shoved and stacked in a pile on what Dominic apparently believed was his property. The excavator arms swept along the full length of the line from the back of the house to the front corner, and in 11 minutes the fence was gone. Walter stood at the window and watched the whole thing. When it was done, he could see directly into Dominic Fitch's backyard for the first time. He could see the string lights Dominic had hung from the patio. He could see the expensive outdoor furniture. He could see Dominic Fitch himself, standing in his back doorway in a robe and coffee cup, watching the pile of cedar boards like a man admiring something he'd just bought. Their eyes met. Dominic raised his coffee cup, not in greeting, the way you raise a glass in a toast. Walter went to his desk. He sat down. He opened his notebook and he wrote the date, the time, a brief description of what had occurred, and then he closed the notebook, placed it in the Fitch folder, and picked up his phone. He dialed the number. "Tommy," he said, "it's time." There was a pause on the other end, then a voice, older, graveled, completely calm. "I've been waiting for this call, Walt. Tell me everything." Here's what nobody knew at the time. Thomas Reginald Payne, born Akron, Ohio, 1948. Enlisted U.S. Army, same year as Walter, same unit, same frozen Korean hills. They had served together for 6 months before Tommy shipped out to a different posting. They had stayed in contact for 70 years. 70 years of Christmas cards, of occasional phone calls, of 2 old soldiers who had carried each other through the worst thing either of them had ever done, survive. After the Army, Tommy went to law school on the GI Bill. Ohio State, finished in the top 4 of his class. Spent 30 years as a practicing attorney in Columbus, specializing in property law, civil litigation, and this is the part that matters: adverse possession, easement disputes, and unlawful demolition cases. He had retired from active practice in 2015. He had never let his bar license lapse. And he had a particular disgust for attorneys who misused their legal knowledge to bully people who didn't have the resources to fight back. "Send me the folder," Tommy said, "every page." Walter scanned every document in the Fitch folder. The original 1974 survey, the certified copy from the county recorder, every letter from Fitch and Callaway, the police report for the truck, the HOA complaint and the zoning response, the photographs of the chrysanthemums, the Lorex camera footage, 4 months of it on a thumb drive in an envelope. He shipped it to Columbus overnight. Tommy called back the following Monday. "Walt," he said, "son, do you have any idea what this man has done?" Let me walk you through what Thomas Paine found when he sat down with Walter's folder and a yellow legal pad on a Sunday afternoon in Columbus, Ohio, in September of 2019. First, the survey. The 1974 survey was certified, notarized, and recorded with Garfield County, a matter of public record. Dominic Fitch, as a property attorney, had access to this document. His own closing documents from April 2019 referenced the same survey. He had been provided at closing the exact coordinates of the property line. The fence was not 12 inches over the line. The fence was 3 inches inside Walter's property. Dominic Fitch had known this, or had the clear legal obligation to know this, before he sent the first letter. Which meant every legal communication from Fitch and Callaway LLC citing the fence as an encroachment was not merely incorrect, it was potentially fraudulent. Knowingly false legal assertions made in written correspondence for the purpose of compelling a property owner to act. That's called abuse of process. It's also potentially actionable as fraud. Second, the fence itself. Under Ohio Revised Code Section 971.07, the demolition of a fence on another person's property, or a fence whose ownership is in legitimate legal dispute, without a court order is unlawful, not just civilly, criminally. It constitutes criminal damaging under ORC 2909.06 if the damage exceeds $500. A cedar fence of that length and construction, built in 1976 and maintained consistently, had a replacement value, Tommy had it appraised, of approximately $28,400. Well over $500. Third, the campaign. Tommy laid out the documented incidents one by one. The keyed truck, the HOA complaint, the zoning complaint, the trash thrown on the holiday, each one individually might be explained away. Together across a documented timeline from May through September, they constituted a pattern: harassment, intentional interference with property rights, and in the case of the truck, criminal damaging and a potential assault on property with forensic evidence attached. Fourth, the camera footage. The Lorex 4K footage of the June 8 truck keying incident was clear enough, when enhanced by a video forensics contractor Tommy knew from his trial days, to match the shoes, a distinctive tan and brown trail runner, rare model, sold by a single retailer in Columbus, to a pair visible in Dominic Fitch's Instagram posts from April 2019. Not Dominic himself, his landscaper's assistant, but the landscaper's assistant, when approached by Tommy's investigator, was happy to discuss what his employer had asked him to do in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Very happy. Fifth, and this is the part that even Tommy had not anticipated. When Tommy began cross-referencing Dominic Fitch's professional history against his property dealings in Garfield County, he found something interesting. Dominic had used the same aggressive boundary dispute strategy at 2 previous properties. Both cases had been settled quietly, one for $40,000, $1 for an undisclosed amount. In both cases, the alleged encroachments had later been found to be inaccurate. This was a pattern. A provable, documented, intentional pattern of using false legal claims to intimidate neighboring property owners into compliance. Tommy made 2 phone calls, one to the Garfield County Prosecutor's Office, one to the Ohio State Bar Association's Office of Disciplinary Counsel. Then he called Walter. "Walt," he said, "we're going to need to set you up with a local attorney to file the suit. I'll co-counsel. I'm thinking we open at $2.8 million and let the punitive damages take care of the rest." Walter was quiet for a moment. "How are you, Tommy?" he said. "I'm good, Walt, real good. Eleanor's chrysanthemums got torn up." Another pause. "I know," Tommy said, "we'll put that in too." Direct hit engagement hook. Now let me pause here because I want you to think about this for a second. Dominic Fitch was a property attorney. He did this for a living. He knew the law. He used the law like a weapon. And what he never once thought to do, not one single time, was to ask himself who the old man on the porch really was. He saw an 83-year-old in a flannel shirt with a coffee mug and he made a calculation. That calculation was wrong in every possible direction. Have you ever underestimated someone and had it cost you? Tell me in the comments. Because what's about to happen to Dominic Fitch is one of the most satisfying things I have ever had the privilege of telling you. The morning of October 14, 2019 was cold, clear, the kind of autumn morning in Ohio that looks like a painting. The maple trees on Clover Hill Lane had gone full amber and red, and the light came in low and gold from the east, and the air smelled like wood smoke and leaf piles and the particular clean cold that comes before the first frost. Walter Ames was on his porch at 7:15. He had his coffee, black, in the same blue ceramic mug he'd used every morning since 1985. Sargent was on the porch rail, watching a bird in the maple tree. The morning was quiet enough that you could hear the leaves moving. He had been up since 5:30. He had shaved carefully. He was wearing his good flannel, the navy blue one, the one Karen had given him for Christmas the year after Eleanor passed. At 7:22, the first vehicle turned onto Clover Hill Lane. A Garfield County Sheriff's Department cruiser, followed by a second cruiser, followed by a white cargo van, followed by a silver Ford Explorer that Walter recognized as belonging to Thomas Reginald Payne of Columbus, Ohio. At 7:24, a process server, a tall woman in a gray blazer carrying an accordion file, walked up the front path of 6 Clover Hill Lane and knocked on the door. At 7:29, Dominic Fitch opened the door. He was in a white terracloth robe. He had a mug in his hand, espresso, from the machine he'd had shipped from a retailer in Brooklyn. His hair was uncombed. He blinked in the morning light. He saw the sheriff's cruisers first, then the woman with the file. Then, behind her, 2 deputies and, getting out of the silver Explorer with the unhurried ease of a man who has done this before, Thomas Reginald Payne, 71 years old, in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly car payments, holding a leather briefcase. Dominic Harlan Fitch, the process server said, "You are hereby served with a civil complaint filed in Garfield County Common Pleas Court, case number 2019 CV1847, by plaintiff Walter James Ames, seeking damages in the amount of $3,240,000 for unlawful demolition of property, tortious interference, fraud, abuse of legal process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." She held out the papers. Dominic didn't take them for 3 full seconds. The second document, which the process server placed on top of the first, was a criminal complaint. Ohio Revised Code 2909.06. Criminal damaging, signed by the Garfield County prosecutor. The third document was from the Ohio State Bar Association's Office of Disciplinary Counsel, notifying Dominic Harlan Fitch that a formal investigation into his professional conduct had been opened and that he was required to respond within 30 days. The 2 sheriff's deputies were not there to make an arrest, not that morning. But they were there with a court order that had been issued the previous afternoon. The cargo van pulled forward and 4 workers in orange vests began unloading equipment. By 9 a.m., they were reinstalling Walter's fence. The court order, signed by Judge Miriam Cole of the Garfield County Common Pleas Court, required the replacement of the demolished fence at Dominic Fitch's expense within 72 hours, using materials matching the original to the extent possible. It also placed a temporary restraining order on any further modification to the shared property boundary pending resolution of the civil case. Tommy walked across the street. He climbed the 3 porch steps. He sat in Eleanor's old chair, the wicker one with the green cushion, and Walter handed him a mug of coffee without a word, because Walter had known Tommy was coming and had made a second cup. They sat together on the porch and drank their coffee and watched the workers put the fence back up while Dominic Fitch stood in his doorway in his robe, holding papers, saying nothing. At some point, Walter wasn't sure exactly when, he noticed that Dominic had gone back inside. The door closed. The fence went up. The maple leaves fell slowly in the cold October light. Word travels fast on a 9-house street. By 9:30, the Ramos family at number 3 were on their porch. By 10, the Hendersons were outside, ostensibly doing yard work, watching with the careful disinterest of people who are absolutely watching. The retired schoolteacher at number 8, a woman named June Whitfield who had lived on Clover Hill Lane for 31 years, brought Walter a plate of zucchini bread and told him quietly that she had been worried about him all summer and that she was glad he was all right. Officer Sandra Greer, who had taken Walter's truck report in June, was not on duty that morning. She drove by anyway. She rolled her window down. She gave Walter a nod that contained, somehow, an entire sentence's worth of meaning. Inside number 6, things were less peaceful. Dominic made 6 phone calls before 10 a.m., 2 to his partners at Fitch and Callaway, both of whom were, shall we say, not enthusiastic about the situation. 1 to his personal attorney, because yes, attorneys need attorneys sometimes, especially in situations like this, who told him to stop talking, stop calling, stop touching anything, and get to Columbus immediately. The Columbus attorney read the complaint, then he read it again. "Dominic," he said finally, "this is very thorough." "It's Walter Ames," Dominic said. "He's an old man, he builds birdhouses." "He retained Thomas Paine," his attorney said. A pause. "The Thomas Paine. There is only one." Dominic sat down. The civil complaint was, by any measure, a formidable document, 47 pages, appendices included. It contained the certified survey, the original deed, the Lorex camera footage submitted on drive timestamp, the police report, the correspondence from Fitch and Callaway with annotations identifying each false legal assertion, the appraisal of the fence at $28,400 replacement value, a forensic analysis of the truck keying video, the sworn statement of the landscaper's assistant, and perhaps most quietly devastating of all, a detailed chronology prepared by Thomas Paine himself, drawn entirely from Walter Ames's brown leather notebook. Every date, every incident, every time, every word spoken. The notebook that Walter had been keeping since May 4, 2019. The notebook that Walter Ames had started keeping on the day he first heard those words, "That fence is going to come down anyway," because 50 years of logistics and supply chain work and military intelligence had taught him one truth above all others. Document everything, especially the things you hope never matter. The moving truck came back to Clover Hill Lane on March 8, 2020. A Saturday, cold, a light snow falling, the street quiet and gray. Nobody waved. The Ramos family watched from their front window. June Whitfield at number 8 had her porch light off. Even the Henderson dog didn't bark. Dominic Fitch loaded what was left of his Glenwood Falls life into a standard 26-foot moving truck, not 2 this time, and drove away in the black BMW. The Range Rover had been sold in January, one of the things that happens when legal fees begin to compound. The civil case, Walter James Ames v. Dominic Harlan Fitch, Garfield County Common Pleas Court, 2019 CV 1847, settled in February of 2020 for $3,200,000. The settlement was not a quiet one. Under the terms negotiated by Thomas Paine, Dominic was prohibited from filing any legal complaint related to properties in Garfield, Delaware, or Licking counties for a period of 5 years. He was required to issue a written acknowledgement that the fence at 4 Clover Hill Lane had at all times been lawfully situated on Walter Ames's property. He was required to fund the complete restoration of Eleanor's garden, including professional replanting of all damaged chrysanthemums. The Ohio State Bar Association's disciplinary process concluded in August of 2020. Dominic Harlan Fitch received a formal reprimand, a matter of permanent public record, and was required to complete 40 hours of continuing legal education and professional responsibility. His partners at Fitch and Callaway quietly restructured the firm's letterhead that fall. His name appeared in smaller font. The criminal damaging case was resolved with a plea to a lesser charge, 4th-degree misdemeanor, fine of $2,500, because the landscaper's assistant had done most of the actual keying and prosecutors had limited appetite for pursuing the indirect case. Walter didn't mind. He'd never been interested in putting anyone in prison. He'd been interested in the record. He'd been interested in the truth. He took the settlement money and did 3 things. He had the fence rebuilt in its original cedar, every board matched to the original dimensions, stained the same dark brown. The contractor who did it, a local man named Pete Garza, whose uncle had served in Vietnam, refused to charge full price. Walter paid full price anyway and left a tip. He set up a college scholarship through Glenwood Falls High School, the Walter and Eleanor Ames Memorial Scholarship, $5,000 per year, renewable, for a graduating senior pursuing a degree in engineering or history. And he called Tyler at Ohio State and told him to bring his roommate home for Thanksgiving because Walter was making a full spread and there was no reason for anybody to eat cafeteria food on a holiday if he could do something about it. Tyler came, so did his roommate. So did Karen from Columbus, who sat with her father on the porch after dinner and held his hand and didn't say anything for a long time, which was exactly right. The chrysanthemums came back the following spring, yellow and full, every plant. Sargent watched them from the porch rail in the April sun with the squinting satisfaction of a cat who has decided things are acceptable. Walter wrote the date in his notebook. He wrote, "Chrysanthemums blooming. Good morning, you would have liked this one." He closed the notebook. He went inside to make coffee. You know, I've told a lot of stories on this channel. Stories about people who pushed too hard, who reached too far, who made the mistake of looking at a quiet life and calling it weakness. Stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things, not because they were looking for a fight, but because they understood something deep and true. That dignity isn't something you surrender just because someone with money and credentials demands it. Walter Ames didn't fight Dominic Fitch because he had something to prove. He fought him because Eleanor's fence was built with his own hands in the summer that he brought his daughter home from the hospital, and because a 3-inch inset of cedar boards was the last physical monument on this earth to the love and the care and the patience of a woman he had spent 40 years with. That's worth fighting for, quietly, methodically, with a brown leather notebook and a phone call to a friend. You see, folks, here's what I want you to carry with you after you close this video tonight. Patience is not the absence of strength, it is the application of it. A man who documents everything, who speaks carefully, who does not react in the moment, that man is not defeated. That man is loading. A military career will teach you many things: how to move under fire, how to hold a line, how to wait, and perhaps most importantly, how to recognize the moment when waiting is over. Walter Ames waited 5 months. He documented every single thing. He called his friend at exactly the right moment. And he sat on his porch and drank his coffee while justice arrived with a court order and a cargo van full of cedar boards. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak man. Never mistake patience for permission. And never ever pick a fight with a Korean War veteran who built that fence with his own hands and kept a notebook from the very first day you arrived. Because he was ready, he was always ready, he just didn't need you to know it yet. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something, hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people who held the line when everything told them to walk away. I'll see you in the next one. This story is inspired by real events and public court records. Names, locations, and specific details have been changed or dramatized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental.